trees, and the sunlight can't reach it. They're all competing for the same resources. They're all fighting for it. And in this case, the trees have won out for now. That's probably not a sustainable situation for very long. That one is going to be susceptible to erosion, gully washers, and everything else happening. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit. Pre-settlement or historic conditions versus desired conditions. When we say historic or pre-settlement, we can only go back so far without just really guessing and doing a real in-depth study. But you can go back to about 1850 with photographs. They did have cameras, I guess, back then. But before that, there was not a lot written down, or it was sketchy when it was. And so we're looking at that time frame. So, like I said before, when you think of prehistoric or historic before things were written down, we're talking about that time frame. Pre-settlement, there were a lot of settlers in the area in the early 1800s, but it wasn't until the Homestead Act of 1860 that a lot of influx of people came in mass numbers. They were always here in small numbers, but after the Homestead Act of 1860, they really started coming in and settling, and that was our first wooing. We talked about the wooing. That's when people started intermingling with the forest. So, over the past 10,000 years, and I say 10,000 because there's been a history of man in the Southwest for that long. So, over the 10,000 years, there's been typically, foresters understand that the norm is that fire has always been here. Fires have been typically low intensity, high frequency. I know we run on a lot of fires that are lightning strikes, sometimes hundreds of them. And if you can imagine a time period where nobody was there to put them out, those fires would just go and burn themselves out. And they just go. So that actually was a healthy situation because it took out the situation that we looked at earlier with the overgrown trees and the thick competition that you saw. A lot of that was taken out every 3 to 10 years, depending on where you were and all that. But they tended to take out that undergrowth, and the forests were actually healthier. So you had a more open situation where you had fewer trees but larger trees was typically what you had. We talked a lot about ladder fields back then. There weren't a whole lot unless there was a situation where there wasn't a fire for an extended period of time. And you didn't have a lot of fires that were standard replacement. They were generally just moderate and severe. Some of them may have burned for months because nobody was there to put them out. And grass was the primary carrier, whereas now it's both. I mean, it's once it gets into timber like we have, then it can be a whole different situation. Okay, so our forests have changed. I've said that we've always had fire, we've always had insects, we've always had the same diseases. There have been some that have been brought in. I mean, there are some exotic things that have been brought in that have been pretty damaging, like the white pine blister rust that is pretty prevalent on the Sacramentos. But for the most part, these things have always been here. And the only thing that's changed is that human activity has increased, say, the last 130 years or so. I mean, depending on how you look at it. So that's been a big factor. So what happened during that time period? You had the western settlement, you had railroads coming in, you had roads. They demanded more wood. In fact, a lot of the wood in the west was shipped back east for building and stuff. There was a lot of logging of the larger trees, which that's why you don't see a whole lot of large trees. A lot of them were logged quite a while back. But the big thing is really, with settlement came the demand for fire suppression. You know, like I said before, you'd get a fire, and nobody was there to put it out, and it would just put itself out. When the next rain came, or they ran out of fuel, or something, it would go out. You start putting man into the equation, and they don't want their house burned up, so they started fighting it. So and then, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, at 1904, was it, when the Forest Service, 05, started were given the task of fire suppression. So that changed the equation a little bit. So you also had heavy grazing. When the people came over, I think one place I saw said that by 1920 there were, it was like 3.2 million cattle or something like that here. Not here in Ruidoso, but I mean in the West. But the land was not grazed before that time, so all of a sudden it was grazed. What did I say the primary carrier of the fire was? Well, if you don't have grass, then you can't carry the fire. So that plus the fire suppression changed the equation a little bit. And so you no longer had that. Of course, you had mining, farming, recreation, roads, and all that. And the big one, or a big one, I guess, for us is climate change. And I'm not even going to attempt to, I'm not a meteorologist or a climatologist and can't predict the future. I can't tell you what's going to happen. Let's just look at what has happened and come up with, see if we can come up with something that's logical. If we look at, well, let me go to the next slide because it really shows it better. This is strictly precipitation. This is not temperature, okay? So I'm not talking global warming, climate, any of that. I'm strictly precipitation. But you can see from the cycles, anything above the black line are years where you had above average moisture. Anything below are years that you had below normal moisture. So it's, I mean, it's pretty clear where you had a series of below normal. You could say that's a drought. Pretty confident. But I think what has happened for us is when you look at it from, probably mid-70s, it looks like on that chart, all the way over to 2010, there's been more above than below. And so we in our minds, because that's what we grew through that time period, is we say that's normal. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but if you look at it long term, you have periods of wet years and periods of drought. And the droughts can sometimes be extended. They can be long periods, or they can be just 1 year and then bounce back. So when we look at what the effects of climate change are, you know, the question that we have to ask is what we're going through right now, are we looking at one of those 20-year periods that's dry? Or is it going to bounce back next year? You know, we don't know. But I tend to believe that this does cycle up and down and up and down. It could be that we could be in a 20-year drought. You know, I don't know. This was the drought monitor that's put out. Unfortunately, this was September 3rd. We got the rains right after. So it's changed. However, it's dry again. But just to give you an idea of the drought conditions and how they might have affected the forest, it's really pretty much the whole West. I mean, it's not just Lincoln County. It's not just New Mexico. It's the whole West. Yeah, we've been hit pretty hard. That's the dark spot right in the middle of New Mexico there. We're in the exceptional, or at that point we were in the exceptional category. It's changed a little bit. But that's a thing that we have to contend with. So when you talk about forest health, that's a key factor. This came from a study that I thought was real interesting to bring out at this point, because it just shows us where we're at as far as our vegetation. We can determine what normal stocking is, and you can do it from historical data, or there's other ways that foresters can determine that. But once you determine what that normal stocking rate is, what that carrying capacity of that particular piece of ground that you're looking at, some interesting things happen through this study. If you go 40%, excuse me, 40% above that, you start getting really suppressed trees, suppressed individual trees and suppressed stands. So 40% above is almost a death march to the trees. Mortality can outpace growth. So that's a real critical situation for the trees, for the forest. If you go 20 to 30% above the normal, you still have that balance of maximizing individual growth and stand vigor. It can vary a little bit depending on the site that you're looking at and so on. If you go 10 to 20%, the trees are doing probably pretty good. There's a lot of natural regeneration. And if you go 10% down below, you get real good individual tree growth and stand vigor. The problem is, if you look at this one, the trees are doing real well, but they're also regenerating real well. And that's real typical of any natural situation, whether it's, you're talking fish eggs or pine seeds. They tend to reproduce in overabundance, hoping that at least a few of them might catch. But if the conditions are right, they may all catch. and you have an overabundance. And so then your succession starts again. And you end up with the situation that we looked at. So I said we have created a situation we're obligated to manage. I read that later and I thought, maybe not necessarily we haven't created. I think we've been given a situation that we're obligated to manage. I mean, we had no control over the climate change, over the, the bark beetle outbreaks and the drought and all of those things. But we did have a part in it because of us being here. We influenced the environment, we influenced the ecosystem. So because we've taken fire out of the management part of it, well, we haven't taken it out completely, but we haven't allowed it to progress like it should, then we have to do other things. So, just real briefly, and this is just because I know that there's a lot of private people that are looking at thinning their own properties. These are very general guidelines. If you're thinking of doing it, give one of the foresters a call and they'll be happy to kind of assist you with this. But just some real general guidelines. What you want to do is separate the crowns. And the reason for that is so that you don't have a crown fire spreading from tree to tree to tree. And so you want to separate them. You want to remove the ladder fields so that the fire doesn't go vertical, up and down the trees and then go tree to tree. So you want to kind of do both. You want to leave the best trees. Uneven age management, I know different people look at this a little different. I know we tend to look at it as looking at the future. If you cut every tree, or if you leave every tree the same size and something happens, say a bark beetle outbreak, you're probably going to lose all of them. So you want to have different ages. So as far as thinning, we were talking about this back there earlier. Spacing is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. It's important to leave quality trees, I guess, is the bottom line. And it's important to, you can leave clumps, you can leave groups of trees, 3 or 4 or 5 or half acre or whatever, depending on how big your place is. It doesn't have to be a park. You know, every tree is, you're going to measure out, measure it, and so on. The land itself will tell you what it should look like, and what's growing there now will kind of determine that. So there's no set grouping. So I did come up with some definitions. Told you it was difficult. So a forester might say that a forest is healthy if it was meeting the management objectives and insects and diseases were at endemic levels, not epidemic levels. And an old stagnant forest was not healthy because it's one step away from a disaster. A wildlife biologist might say a healthy forest would be composed of live trees, standing dead trees, leaning trees, down trees, and it would include meadows, and it would include young trees, and it would include full trees, because that's where wildlife grow. A hydrologist would say the most important part is the ground cover, because that's going to catch the water and return it to the ground, and the watershed is going to be improved. A fire ecologist might say that a healthy forest is one in which fire goes through it regularly and cleans it up, and is more on a natural frequency. A wilderness specialist might say that a healthy forest is one where natural processes were allowed to play out without interference from humans at all, period. So which one is correct? They all are. It depends on your management objectives. It depends on what you expect from that forest. You know, we expect a lot from our forest. We expect it to be there for us as far as recreation, hunting, wood gathering, logging, grazing, all the things that we get from the forest, and they all have to be managed a little differently, depending on what you want out of it. So that is all the presentation, and we're going to have some people come up, and if you all have any questions, hopefully we can answer them. You guys want to come on up? Okay, let these people introduce themselves so that you all know who they are. Start with Dave.
I'm Dave Warnack. I'm the district ranger here for Smoky Trail Ranger District of the Lincoln.
I'm Linda Harrington, the fuels planner or wildfire management specialist for the BIA Mescalero.
I'm Dan. I'm a fuel specialist at the Smoky Bear Ranger District. I was hoping Dave would cover these questions.
So they can tell me what I said that was wrong.
I think you summed it up good. At the end, you know, with the, what does a forester look at the forest, or a timber stand, and, you know, wilderness specialists, and with us, with the Forest Service, we have all those people, and it's quite an ordeal. We go through the planning process, what we're gonna do, what we're not gonna do, all the disciplines together. So whenever we put an activity or treatment together, we do have a primary goal, or maybe a few primary goals, might be emphasizing range management, range improvements, or watershed, or fuels, hazardous fuel reduction, but we always try to take into account what is going to affect our wildlife or the watershed, and try to make sure we're not having, you know, something, you know, off balance with a huge problem that we're going to cause with a small benefit to one thing. So it's quite a challenging thing.
And with state forestry, we're a service organization. We're helping private landowners. So you know from having neighbors that what you think is important is not necessarily what your neighbor thinks is important. And so it's a challenge to meet with landowners and assist them with what their management plan is, whether it's half acre or 5,000 acres. Some are going to be more complex, some are going to be very simple. But we try to take into consideration what you want your property to look like, and the same thing with your neighbor. So it's not always the same prescription and the same assistance that we give.
One thing I'd like to bring out, and when you take natural processes out of the ecosystem, like fire and bugs and those kind of things, then if you want to keep a healthy forest, then you've got to put some energy back in it in order to maintain what you want. And so that's where most of us are here, particularly in the WUI. We don't want fires next to our house, and we don't want bug kill to run through our towns or any of those kind of things. But if you want to keep a healthy environment and you don't let nature come into equilibrium the way it's trying to anyway, then you have to use resources at hand, which in this case might be thinning, burning, whatever, in order to maintain that. And so to think that we can do nothing and maintain a healthy forest, you get the kind of thing that Frank showed with the dense forest, the trees that nothing's healthy, and so then nature does take a course. And that's one of the reasons you're seeing the big fires you see all over the West, is because we've gotten to that position where we've got so much fuel that once it gets started, it's really hard to control. And to get back to where we want to get, particularly in the urban wildland interface, is it takes money. It takes money and work. And that's kind of where we all are right now.
As we're all going down the line. I think a healthy forest, it all depends on your perspective and the objectives of how we manage the forest. In the back 40 is obviously not how we manage the forest. In our backyard, I think that with living in the wild and urban interface, in a community that is in the woods, healthy forest is one that doesn't burn our houses down, or is less likely to burn our houses down. Because now we are part of that process. Our houses, our residents are very, doing those things is, not something we would ever think about doing if there weren't, if there wasn't a community here. But, now that we've gone ahead and popped a community in the middle of the woods, we have to manage for that as well.
Kind of from my perspective, especially working with the tribe, a lot of our goals are, are to manage the land and manage the forests for the tribal trusts for the benefit of the tribe, which isn't just economic, but it's also spiritual and cultural uses. And so, in my mind, when we're talking about a healthy forest, we're talking about needing to manage that forest, and quite often, many of our objectives have overlap each other. We're talking about, having a healthy watershed and protecting against wildland, highly destructive wildland fire. A lot of those objectives are the same, or certainly the treatments are the same. And so the more that, different, neighbors can work together and, combine their ideas and combine their efforts, well, we end up with a healthier forest with multiple uses, multiple goals.
One other point I'd like to bring out is that the forest we have around here, for the most part, is a relatively young forest. It's not an old, over mature forest. And so to think we have to save all the little trees and those kind of things is kind of counterproductive, because ponderosa pine trees live to be 300–400 years old, and most of the forests you see around here are probably less than 100 years old. And so they've got a ways to go.
Looking at the woods in my backyard, I'd have to say that, and I'm not an expert, but it looks like I have an epidemic of pine bark beetle, its beetle, what have you. What is the prognosis? And you see a lot of that around here for this. And what sort of energy should we put into this to try and help the citizen as a private property owner?
Somebody want to tackle that?
I'll tackle just for a second. The only thing that's really going to stop an epidemic of bark beetles is going to be natural rain. It's going to slow it down. We can do some things like treat trees that die from bark beetles. We can grind them up and we can cover them with plastic, and we can do a lot of other things to maybe impact your area. We can spray the trees, we can do that. But the only thing that'll actually help the epidemic, in my opinion, is to get water and also make the trees healthy. The thing we can do for the next epidemic, though, is to make sure that our trees, even in dry times, have enough water, and we do that by spacing the trees and having fewer trees.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just add that because it is at epidemic levels, and typically epidemics will peak, we're hoping that it peaked, and it's on the decline. There's no way of knowing for sure, but when it runs out of fuel.
Well, you guys, you identify problem areas, and if you do, like overgrowth, or it's not trimmed properly, or what do y'all do about it? Is there some place you report it to, and you call Smokey Bear in Washington, and he comes out, or what happens?
Well, I think that all comes down to land ownership and the jurisdiction. In this community, we are surrounded by national forest. On the national forest, the U.S. Forest Service is the